Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I am joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going this week, Joe?
All right, Mark. Reflecting a lot this week about the fact that 1 year ago this week, everything shut down in America.
Yeah.
For COVID.
March 12th, 2020 was my last day in the office before we were all sent home. And we're recording this on March 12th, so it was exactly 1 year ago.
Yes. Well, my last day in the office was March 10th, and I'm acutely aware of that date because I went home not feeling well and woke up the next day with fever and chills that turned out to be COVID. So I got COVID a year ago this week.
And I know in the past you talked about your sense of taste and smell having disappeared. What state of recovery are you in?
Smell is quite far along, I'm happy to say. I would say I probably have about 80% of my former sense of smell. Except for very faint aromas, it feels kind of normal-ish now. But the same is not true of taste, actually, which very disappointing. I would say maybe I've got half of my old sense of taste back at best. I still have a lot of trouble, figuring out what flavor am I tasting. So really sucks.
And have you found that that's affected your appetite? Like, do you have to remind yourself to eat because you don't savor it like you used to?
Not one bit. I'm still as hungry as I ever was. I just don't know what the hell I'm eating.
Well, depending on who's doing the cooking, that could actually be an advantage.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Well, so let's move on. So last week I asked you about something that had come up in the news somewhat tangentially. During the cold freeze in Texas, the Republican governor blamed the power outages in that state on the Green New Deal, which was more a way of just antagonizing Democrats than it was actually explaining the situation. But it did pose the question for me, like, where do we stand now with the Green New Deal? And the question I asked is, where does it land on the continuum from hashtag and political slogan on the one end to serious, carefully thought out legislation on the other? And how likely is it, do you think, that the Green New Deal will become the law of the land within the foreseeable future? So what did you find?
Well, I found a lot. This was a very meaty question. And as I often do, I would like to start with a short answer because I think it kind of frames my thoughts and kind of an insight into the conversation that we're going to have today. So the short answer is that the Green New Deal is an aspirational document. It's a loose framework that sets out sweeping policy goals for potential climate change legislation. I would say it's neither sloganeering nor fine-grained policy, but one thing it is deadly serious. And to your last question, it's never going to become the law of the land because it isn't legislation. But elements of it are likely to be baked into upcoming bills moved by the new Democratic majority in Congress. So that's the short answer. Before I explain what the Green New Deal is, I thought it would be fun to start with what it isn't. I want to take you back 2 short years to CPAC 2019, the Conservative Political Action Conference, which took place just a few weeks after the Green New Deal was unveiled. Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina, who later became Donald Trump's last chief of staff, said this about the Green New Deal to the audience at CPAC, quote, "They're trying to get rid of all the cows." End quote.
Yeah, that's the heart of it. It's anti-cow legislation.
Yes. And here's what part-time Trump advisor and full-time pompous ass Dr. Sebastian Gorka had to say. Quote, "They want to take your pickup truck. They want to rebuild your home. They want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about but never achieved." End quote. And all this time, Mark, I thought Stalin dreamt about things like mass repression and ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, all this time was actually hamburgers that were pissing him off.
That's right. You learn something new every day.
Yeah, shaking his fist at the Moscow sky. Hamburger!
Right. But it's not just at CPAC that Republicans bashed the Green New Deal. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming called it a socialist manifesto. Representative Rob Bishop of Utah said it was tantamount to genocide, later adding that his declaration was maybe an overstatement. You think?
Yeah, maybe. Just a tiny little bit.
And not to be outdone, former President Trump said in a Fox Business interview on August 13th of last year that adopting the Green New Deal would result in the demolition of the Empire State Building and the abolishment of all animals. Your dog, my dog, abolished.
Well, that's just harsh. My dog's very sweet.
And of course, most recently, as you pointed out in your question, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas blamed his state's woefully insufficient response to the power outages caused by a winter storm on frozen wind turbines and the Green New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
These critiques, if you can even call them that, are not worth rebutting point by point. But let's spend a minute on the Republicans' bovine obsession, because there's a kernel of truth embedded in that cow patty.
Yes, it's a methane-shaped truth, right?
Yeah. The Green New Deal explicitly addresses agriculture, which is responsible for approximately 14% of the world's greenhouse gases, due mainly to methane emissions from the world's 1.5 billion cows. But the line that sent the GOP into hysterics is not in the Green New Deal itself. It comes from an FAQ document released publicly by the staff of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which contains the following sentence about meeting emissions targets. And I quote, "We set a goal to get to net zero rather than zero emissions in 10 years, because we aren't sure that we'll be able to fully get rid of farting cows and airplanes that fast. But we think we can ramp up renewable manufacturing and power production, retrofit every building in America, build the smart grid, overhaul transportation and agriculture, plant lots of trees, and restore our ecosystem to get to net zero."
Yeah.
End quote.
Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of a stretch to interpret that line to mean they're coming for your hamburgers. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's a perfect little demagoguery 101 lesson that if you have a long statement that has a number of particulars in that, isolate the single objectionable element for the meat and potatoes voting demographic core and just hammer that one point. So if you don't want to talk about planting trees or cars getting catalytic converters and that sort of thing, just talk hamburger, because you can get people who don't really want to understand the issue upset about it.
Yeah, right. I think that's true. And, you know, the only dodgy thing I heard in that sentence was the claim that cow farting is the primary driver of methane pollution. It's actually cow belching that releases most of the methane. Did you know, Mark, that a cow expels between 26 and 132 gallons of methane gas into the atmosphere every day? That's comparable to the pollution produced by a car. There are ways to control cow belching by introducing garlic into their diets, but I'll leave that topic for you to research in our next episode.
Yes, on cow diets.
Though efforts to transition the U.S. economy away from non-renewable energy have bubbled up periodically since the 1970s, the term Green New Deal didn't come into existence until the 2000s. An early use was by the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman in January 2007, when he referred to the green version of the New Deal. Jill Stein of the Green Party ran for president on a Green New Deal platform in 2012 and 2016, as did Bernie Sanders in 2016. But it wasn't until the Democrats recaptured the House of Representatives in the 2018 elections that a Green New Deal caucus began to emerge, led by incoming freshman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC for short, from New York's 14th Congressional District.
Yeah. And bringing with her just an absolute genius for getting attention on certain topics. She uses social media, for instance, better than any other congressman I can think of.
Yes, true. It's important to consider the Green New Deal in the context of what the world was already trying to do to combat climate change. The 2015 Paris Climate Accord, which was signed by nearly 200 countries, set out to limit the 21st century's global average temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at worst 2 degrees Celsius, above the levels from the pre-industrial era, which is defined as the years 1850 to 1900. That's a very ambitious goal, considering that global temperatures have already increased by 1 full degree Celsius from pre-industrial levels and could reach 1.5 degrees as soon as 2030. Each country that ratified the Paris Accord came up with its own individual plan to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The USA, under President Obama, pledged to cut emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by the year 2025. Unfortunately for all of us, we made almost no progress on that goal during the last 4 years as President Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accord. And it's very difficult to imagine us meeting the Obama goal without drastic action. Many other countries are also failing to meet their individual goals or revising their goals to be less ambitious, which, of course, imperils the overall progress of the accord. In October 2018, a month before the 2018 elections here in the U.S., the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is cited at the beginning of the Green New Deal, reaffirmed the Paris goal of capping the global temperature increase at 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Its report suggested that humanity has little more than a decade to get carbon emissions under control before the catastrophic impacts of climate change become unavoidable. And that brings us to the Green New Deal itself, which was introduced as House Resolution 109 in the 116th Congress by AOC and Senator Edward Markey of Massachusetts on February 7, 2019. In drafting the resolution, Markey, AOC, and their House co-sponsors worked closely with environmental nonprofits, social justice organizations, and progressive think tanks. Here's a key point. It's a non-binding resolution, meaning that it's not legislation, and it wouldn't in and of itself create any new programs. If it were to pass the House, it would simply reflect the sense of the body that, to meet the goals set out in the resolution, quote, it is the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, end quote. Non-binding resolutions in the House are not unusual. They're passed for things as trivial as congratulating Super Bowl winners and for sending messages to the sitting president about policies the House disapproves of. Mm-hmm. The House has yet to vote on the Green New Deal. Speaker Nancy Pelosi was non-committal about it, and that's being charitable. I think she called it the Green Dream or something like that in one of her early comments. And it's not entirely clear whether it would pass the chamber even with its Democratic majority. Instead, it was referred to 11 different House committees for the further work of studying the subject matter and then maybe drafting legislation based on it. Meanwhile, on March 26, 2019, Mitch McConnell called for an immediate Senate vote on the resolution without the usual hearings, expert testimony, or debate among the members. The Green New Deal was soundly defeated by a vote of 57-0, with 42 Democratic senators and the independent Bernie Sanders voting present in protest of McConnell's tactics.
Yeah, if you're not even going to hear testimony on the topic, then you're not treating it seriously.
Right, so why play along with the charade? The Green New Deal resolution, H.R. 109, is just 14 pages long and is a quick read. I encourage everyone listening to this podcast to read it. We'll post it to our Facebook page as one of the sources for this episode. I read the Green New Deal at its core as a statement of first principles, a progressive blueprint for transitioning to a green economy. It offers some radical measures its proponents believe are necessary to cut carbon emissions down to net zero. It aims both to create jobs and to boost the economy. It outlines how we can combat climate change using national policy backed up by the Congressional purse. Central to its agenda is that we decarbonize the economy in ways that make it fairer and more just for the poor and minority communities that were neglected by the original New Deal and are likely to be disadvantaged by the massive economic upheaval called for by the Green New Deal. Instead of focusing on what is politically possible, the Green New Deal argues forcefully for policies that match the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
Dave Roberts, writing in Vox in December 2018, described the Green New Deal like this, quote, "It is not merely a way to reduce emissions, but also to ameliorate the other symptoms and dysfunctions of a late capitalist economy, growing inequality and concentration of power at the top. The Green New Deal is at its heart a form of social democratic populism. Its intent is to involve the entire citizenry in the shared project of adapting to the 21st century, and in so doing, materially improve the quality of life of the poor and middle class. It is an attempt to rebalance the economy and the political system away from a monomaniacal focus on private goods toward a more generous view of public goods and public purpose." End quote. And that's precisely why it's so scary to Republicans and others who benefit from the status quo, and why the smear campaign I outlined at the beginning is already well underway.
Well, it's legislation, or at least proposed legislation, that takes on a whole lot of targets at the same time.
Yes.
It's got global warming, and it's got racism, and it's got sort of the economic transformation of the country and raising the poor out of poverty. And it kind of reminds me of the old movies of Robin Hood, where he would shoot 7 arrows at 7 targets. And I'm far closer, I feel like, in perspective to AOC than I am to Nancy Pelosi. But I wonder if Nancy Pelosi, like me, is wondering if aiming at 7 targets means that you miss 7 targets, but if you aim at 1 or 2 targets, then you might actually hit.
Yeah, it's a good point. And in a minute, I'm going to read directly from the Green New Deal to give you a sense of its vast scope that you mentioned. And then let's talk some more about this.
Okay.
The backers of the Green New Deal believe that we're in a climate emergency that requires desperate measures. I agree that we're in a climate emergency, so I'm sympathetic with the aims of the Green New Deal. I also believe that when most Americans agree about something important, not only are we capable of incredible achievements like putting an astronaut on the moon in less than a decade, but we also tolerate significant impingements on our freedom in order to achieve those agreed upon goals. A great example of this happened during World War II when the FDR administration nationalized a lot of industries to assist in the war effort. The giant mail-order corporation Montgomery Ward was enlisted to manufacture things ranging from auto parts to soldiers' uniforms. In 1944, the National War Labor Board ordered the company to allow its employees to unionize to stave off a threatened strike at its plants. But Montgomery Ward's president, Sewell Avery, refused the unionization order. Rather than face a strike that might have crippled production, FDR ordered the Army National Guard to seize the company's main plant in Chicago, and in so doing, the guardsmen literally carried Avery out of his office. The federal government ended up seizing several other Montgomery Ward plants throughout the country, and FDR's actions were later sustained by the courts. In fact, by the end of the war, about a quarter of all domestic manufacturing had been nationalized, which, think about that, that's a stunning thing to comprehend in 2021 as we finally part ways with half a century of conservative dogma in which government action was inhibited and usually described as the problem, not the solution.
Mm-hmm.
The backers of the Green New Deal are basically arguing that we regard the climate emergency with the same gravity that FDR regarded the war production effort. Of course, if you don't believe it's an emergency, the goals of the Green New Deal look more like an intrusive federal government imposing its will on states and localities and inhibiting the freedom of its citizens. And that's basically where we are in our polarized nation today. It's hard to get big things done when you have to drag nearly half the population along, kicking and screaming. Is the Green New Deal ambitious? Without a doubt. According to that FAQ from AOC's staff, the one with the line about the farting cows, the Green New Deal is, quote, a 10-year plan to mobilize every aspect of the American society at a scale not seen since World War II. To achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions and create economic prosperity for all, end quote. To get there, it lists a sweeping array of goals, some of which seem to be only tangentially related to climate change. Now I'm going to read you a few of the goals that caught my eye and get your reaction to these, Mark. These are quotes scattered throughout the text of the Green New Deal. Here's the first one. Upgrading all existing buildings in the United States and building new buildings to achieve maximum energy efficiency, water efficiency, safety, affordability, comfort, and durability, including through electrification. And here's the second one. Providing resources, training, and high-quality education, including higher education, to all people of the United States, with a focus on frontline and vulnerable communities so that all people of the United States may be full and equal participants in the Green New Deal mobilization. Third one, guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security to all people of the United States. And one more, providing all people of the United States with high-quality health care, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security, and clean water, clean air, healthy and affordable food, and access to nature, end quote. So you see what I mean about it being neither sloganeering nor policy?
Yeah, it's like charting a path right down the middle in terms of being very specific about his goals, but
yes,
completely agnostic about how we get there.
Yes. I mean, I think of a slogan as give peace a chance, right? Or si se puede, right, or something like that, right? That's a slogan. This is much more substantial than a slogan. And yet it's not a bill. It's not policy.
Right.
It's goals, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Like just, I mean, there are so many things that we could talk about in that list, but just to take an example, providing quality food to all Americans, like how on earth would you even approach that? Like that alone is a multi-year policy goal where there would be hearings and expert testimony and back and forth and then a rollout plan. And that's just a single clause within that statement.
Yes. And the proponents of the Green New Deal know this. They're not idiots, but they think it's necessary. Some of these line items sound like pipe dreams, given the current political reality. But Green New Deal proponents argue that this is what a holistic vision of climate remediation looks like. You can't meet the temperature rise targets of the Paris Accord by simply building new climate-friendly housing and infrastructure. You also need to refurbish existing buildings of all kinds, since buildings account for 40% of annual carbon emissions in the U.S. You can't enlist the legions of Americans we need to work on all these daunting projects if you don't educate them well and pay them a living wage. And you can't embark on a Green New Deal that leaves behind the very same historically disadvantaged people who were not allowed to reap the rewards of the last New Deal.
Yeah.
Would the Green New Deal be expensive? Unquestionably, yes. One center-right group estimated its total cost at between $51 and $93 trillion over the next decade, which is about $600,000 per household. But that estimate includes $36 trillion for universal health care, which is referenced in the Green New Deal but isn't directly related to greening the economy.
Right.
Modernizing our electrical grid alone is expected to cost at least $500 billion. And wouldn't the people of Texas like to see that happen immediately?
There's an aspect to like this laundry list of targets that makes me wonder if the hidden strategy behind it is like if you ask for the moon, you can settle for the stars, that if you put everything on the table and aggressively pursue it, maybe the compromise position you arrive at is far advanced than what you would arrive at if you went in with a more sensible point of view.
Maybe. I haven't thought about that. They'll never admit it.
Sure.
But, if you think about the COVID bill that just passed Congress, you can almost make the same argument, right?
Yeah.
Reach for the stars, and then if you only get the moon, that might be good enough. All right, so when we take stock of all these costs, I think the time horizon really matters. What might seem a boondoggle over the first 10 years could turn out to be a net cost saver over 30 to 50 years. Modernizing the electrical grid would ultimately save money by saving energy. A fleet of all-electric vehicles would eliminate fuel costs and get us off gasoline. A world in which the Green New Deal was adopted would likely be a world in which catastrophic floods and famine were avoided, or at worst, minimized. It would save us the huge costs of rebuilding cities after disasters while having the fringe benefit of being the right thing to do, economically and morally. For the Green New Deal to instill long-term benefits like those, it would have to produce radical change to American society since we currently depend so heavily on unsustainable activities. We burn fossil fuels at unconscionable rates and create massive amounts of unnecessary waste. Turning that around will require a dramatic shift in the way we work and live our lives. As a worldwide consensus of scientists has made clear, the scale of the change we need to make is massive and will require an economy-wide mobilization of the sort we Americans haven't seen since World War II. AOC's Chief of Staff, Saikat Chakrabarti, described it as, quote, a massive system upgrade for the economy, end quote. And Chakrabarti's rationale is that big things are going to happen whether or not we implement the Green New Deal. Another quote from him, the two options are either we're going to intentionally do the big things we want, or big things we don't want will happen to us, end quote. Technically speaking, this is about national industrial policy. To accomplish the aims of the Green New Deal, the federal government must play a decisive role in shaping the direction of the economy. The term industrial policy sends shivers up the spines of many conservatives who liken it to the state control of industry as in the Soviet communist system, or to the tightly managed economies of Europe and Scandinavia. But let's put this in perspective. It's not like the U.S. government isn't already in the business of picking industrial winners and losers. We currently subsidize the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $20 billion a year if you include direct and indirect payments. Backers of the Green New Deal would like to redirect those subsidies to the clean energy sector. It's akin to the economic planning we practiced during World War II, like my anecdote about Montgomery Ward, where certain industries were repurposed to build different things to support the war effort. One of the central goals of a Green New Deal would be to ratchet up the share of total energy demand served by electricity. Many experts believe that to be on the right track by mid-century, we'll need for 60% of our energy to be distributed by a zero-carbon electricity sector, which is a sharp increase from the 20% we have today. This means switching over from combustion-based cars, heating and cooling systems to electrical power. Reconfiguring the electrical grid requires a massive investment in scaling up renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and geothermal, and a corresponding disinvestment in fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. So here's a microcosm from my own life about the challenges and also the opportunities that we face. I live in a cooperative apartment building in New York City. And for those who don't know what a co-op is, I don't own my apartment. I own shares in a corporation with my fellow residents of my building. And just this past week, the co-op board in my building began talking about how and when to upgrade the decrepit 60-year-old HVAC system in our building. HVAC is acronym for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And we need to upgrade that system to meet New York City's stringent decarbonization compliance standards that come into effect in a few years. The co-op board believes, and I agree, that instead of simply buying a new, more energy-efficient boiler, which might put us in compliance for a few years but won't rectify the root problem of burning carbon, we should instead invest in a new state-of-the-art electrical HVAC system that will cost a lot of money up front. And I mean, it's a lot of money. It's estimated at $15 million
Wow.
that will be shared by the residents of my building, probably through an assessment made to our maintenance bill every month for several years.
Wow.
But that huge expense up front will save us tons of money in the long run and help the environment. These are the kinds of decisions that are being made all over the country right now, and government has a role to play, both with its bully pulpit and in crafting an industrial policy that incentivizes the switch over to green technologies with tax breaks, subsidies to states and local governments, and tax penalties to the laggards who don't get with the program.
Yeah, and at the very least, cease with the activity of propping up sources like coal and increasingly petroleum.
Yes. Because of our country's continued love affair with fossil fuels, especially the recently deposed president who focused his energies on increasing coal production, and whose policies were written entirely by coal lobbyists turned cabinet secretaries, we are at risk of missing some opportunities. For example, a lot of the green energy infrastructure, like the photovoltaic module used to generate solar energy, is sourced from Asia. One of the enormous challenges facing us is to expand our renewables manufacturing sector and then retrain all those West Virginia coal miners to become solar panel makers and installers.
And I think that part is critical. If you're coming to the American people with a scenario of we need to make this change and it's going to hurt in the short term, you're going to need to make sacrifices, and by the way, other people are going to benefit by it, they will never give their support to that. You will never get Hispanics in Texas voting for that. So you would never see a blue scenario there. If, however, you can go in and say you might lose your petroleum job, but you'll get a better paying job in wind turbines or solar or some other related industry, and if that's backed up by specifics, not empty promises, but by this is what's going to happen, and you can see it happening right now, then I think there's some possibility there.
Yes, I agree. And if I can mix my metaphors, we definitely all need to have skin in this game, but at the same time, it can't just be about sticks. There have to be carrots as well, and retraining is one of the key carrots I think we employ to bring along a lot of perhaps skeptical citizens.
Right.
So, but in addition to winding down fossil fuel production and scaling up renewable energy, the Green New Deal is also about investing huge sums of money in the R&D required to transition some industries that are especially difficult to decarbonize, like airlines and steel production, and get them off fossil fuels over the next few decades. AOC's talking points call for us to build, quote, high-speed rail at a scale where air travel stops becoming necessary, end quote, which is a realistic goal considering that the Japanese have had high-speed rail since the 1960s.
Yeah. Though it's worth pointing out that the Japanese have much higher density of population. So if you're comparing, for instance, a high-speed rail system within Japan, ending up at Tokyo, it can go through a number of urban centers on its way there. But if you're going from, let's say, a Los Angeles to a Chicago, there's a lot of empty territory in between the two. So the economics don't necessarily line up.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, we can achieve a decarbonized planet by ourselves. The use of coal has risen over the past few years due mainly to the countries of Asia, which account for about 3/4 of global coal consumption. That said, even though China surpassed the U.S. as the #1 carbon polluter about a decade ago, over time, we are still the world's undisputed champion polluter. From the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through the year 2014, the U.S. was responsible for 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, despite constituting only 4.23% of the world's current population. And even with China and other developing nations burning fossil fuels like never before, we still account for 15% of the world's emissions today. Proponents believe that if the U.S. goes all in on the Green New Deal, our country will become a major exporter of the technology, products, services, and expertise that will help other countries become carbon neutral, which would also help seed a global Green New Deal, much like the Marshall Plan did to rebuild shattered European economies after World War II. That would be great for business here at home, but so many other countries are already way out ahead of us on green technologies that we're playing catch-up. So now that the Green New Deal is on the table, what happens next? There are centrists and even conservatives who are sincere in their desire to address climate change. Their preferred methods, which include nuclear power, hydropower, fossil fuel extraction with carbon capture and storage, known as sequestration, plus the carbon tax and cap-and-trade legislation. Those things may one day become part of a grand compromise with Green New Deal advocates who, as I mentioned earlier, acknowledge in the text of their own resolution that net zero emissions are much more likely than zero emissions, at least in the short term. In other words, we're still going to be burning some fossil fuels even in the near to moderate term future, but if we can do other things to mitigate that, we can achieve net zero.
Yeah.
For instance, a per-ton tax on the 5.4 billion metric tons of carbon generated by the U.S. economy every year would generate a lot of money, which of course is what Green New Deal advocates need to implement most of their proposals. But Congress has considered over 50 carbon pricing bills in the last 30 years, and exactly 0 of them have become law. Ever since Barack Obama became president a dozen years ago, Republicans by and large have been implacably opposed to carbon pricing. Even if Republicans suddenly saw the light and supported a carbon tax, most experts now believe it would be too little too late. All of which is to say that I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for non-progressives to save the day.
Yeah, though it's hard to imagine progressives dragging the rest of the country kicking and screaming towards this, because if they have a majority, at times it seems to be a razor-thin one, which makes it like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back overall historical progression, which could also be less than what we need in order to reduce emissions before it becomes irreversible.
Yeah, well, let's see about that, though. Now that the Democrats control Congress and the presidency, those 11 House committees to which the Green New Deal resolution was assigned in 2019 are finally at work writing legislation. And there's talk that President Biden's next big legislative push after the pandemic relief bill that just passed will be an infrastructure bill. Biden declined to endorse the Green New Deal during the 2020 presidential race, but to quote his campaign's catchphrase, he's on board with building back better. And that includes a few Green New Deal friendly items like the transition to more energy efficient buildings, ramping up renewable energy generation, and increasing fuel efficiency standards for cars. Biden also made sure we immediately rejoin the Paris Accord. The arcane Senate rules allow Democrats to use budget reconciliation one more time this calendar year, and that requires only a bare majority vote. So I think there's a reasonable chance that some elements of the Green New Deal agenda may get enacted in the Democrats' infrastructure bill later this year. But keep in mind also that we've been talking solely about federal efforts. The states are the real incubators of policy ideas, and it's entirely possible that a bunch of blue states will pass mini Green New Deals over the next few years.
Yeah.
Thus far, most Green New Deal items poll well, so there might soon be crowds of citizens pushing their state and local lawmakers to fill the breach if the federal response is not sufficient.
Yeah, Washington State has been playing with the idea of a cap-and-trade system for the last few years.
Yes. So Dave Roberts, again, in a wonderful Vox article, said, I'm going to quote him again, "The delicate dance is to keep the Green New Deal fuzzy enough to allow a broad coalition of people and interests to see themselves in it, while specifying it enough to avoid having it watered down into a feel-good buzzword." End quote. At the end of the day, the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, what's the alternative to the Green New Deal? Sure, it's obscenely expensive, but so is sitting on our hands, as the billions in recent costs to combat numerous wildfires, hurricanes, and 100-year floods has made plain.
Yeah.
In the National Climate Assessment released in October 2018, before some of the most catastrophic wildfires and floods, 13 federal agencies predicted that by the year 2100, sea level rise is likely to cost us $118 billion, while heat-related deaths could cost an additional $141 billion, and infrastructure damage may run us $32 billion more.
So, I mean, there's a sad preaching to the choir element to this, that those of us who believe that global warming is real, we are already on board with remedies for that. But there is a large body of people who refuse to admit that there's an anthropogenic aspect to global warming, or that global warming exists at all. And so therefore they're going to see the Green New Deal as a big, expensive solution to a non-existent problem.
Right. Well, it's my hope that those people lost the last election and they are in the minority.
Mm-hmm.
So, but try this argument on for size, Mark. You can argue that the 1 or 2% investment of GDP that some experts say a Green New Deal would cost is not unreasonable, and that's before you factor in the millions of net jobs created by the transition from fossil fuels to green energy, which would bolster tax revenues and increase consumer spending as well. You can also argue that when we're advancing the national interest, as in times of war, or even when digging out from an economic crisis as we are right now with the COVID pandemic, focusing on how much it costs is silly and self-defeating. It costs what it costs, and we're going to pay that price for the good of the nation. Compared to that, the Republican alternative is arguably worse than doing nothing. In addition to squawking about hamburgers and consistently voting down carbon pricing plans that by themselves are no longer even sufficient to deal with the scope of the problem, Republicans also seek to undo whatever incremental progress Democrats manage to make when they are in power, thus making it even harder to reach the already daunting targets of the Paris Accord. So you tell me which alternative is the batshit crazy one.
Mm-hmm.
Leading the world and doing whatever it takes to address this century's existential problem? Or acting like the problem doesn't exist while our country fades into impotence and irrelevancy? That's what Stalin dreamt about but never achieved.
And it was not Stalin, but his predecessor who said that the capitalist countries will sell us the rope with which to hang them. So...
yeah. Right.
I've been thinking of this as you've been speaking about many of these topics, but the notion that the Green New Deal is too expensive, but that it will bring in economic benefit on the back end. I've heard that before with Ronald Reagan talking about trickle-down economics, where cutting taxes for the rich would be expensive in the short term, but it will bring a huge economic benefit later. So it's not like conservatives have not come to us with this sort of idea. It's just this is not an idea that immediately puts money into the pockets of billionaires, so they're not quite as excited about it.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, Mark, because not only have they come to us with that idea, but we've passed it over and over and over again. There were the Reagan tax cuts and the Bush senior tax cuts, the Bush junior tax cuts, and then Trump's tax cuts. We keep doing that over and over again. Why not try this new thing once?
Yeah, and maybe pay for it by reinstituting a few of those taxes.
Yeah. So here's my final thought on the matter. Whatever happens, it seems clear to me that the Green New Deal is going to serve as both a touchstone and a lightning rod for the national discussion we need to have around climate change. Hopefully, we'll be successful in mitigating the climate catastrophes to come. But that is by no means a given, with polarization now the norm in Washington, and a creeping tyranny of the minority, thus far preventing Democrats from acting. Nonetheless, my optimism and my patriotism lead me to believe that we will solve these problems, and I predict that the Green New Deal will be remembered someday as a call to arms, much like JFK's speech announcing that we would put a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. It's not the end of the process, but the beginning. And we have to start somewhere.
Yeah. And it occurs to me that maybe it's the audacity of the plan that makes it a powerful one, because that's the sort of thing that gets a voting base excited about getting out the vote and maintaining majorities in Congress and electing presidents. And so let's say in some hypothetical alternative universe, AOC was more inclined to bring forward careful legislation and respecting her superiors and just came forward with incremental upgrades. That's not going to get people marching in the street. That's not going to get young people jazzed about supporting candidates.
Right.
And so maybe it's just the mere fact that this is a breathtakingly audacious plan is what makes it powerful.
And also, I would add to your thought, which I agree with, that it's an audacity that kind of meets a moment, you know, not only because we're in the middle of these cascading crises of COVID, recession, etc., but also because we seem to be, as I mentioned earlier, we seem to be emerging from 50 years of the conservative domination of the conversation in our country. That passage of the pandemic bill this week, kind of which a lot of liberals like Paul Krugman says he's pinching himself because it's so unbelievably good he can't believe it got passed. Well, I'm thinking we're entering a moment now where those things are possible, and the audacity of the Green New Deal is equal to this moment.
Yeah. And part and parcel of the conservative domination of political thought in this country, stretching back really almost to Ronald Reagan, almost exclusively the dialogue has been what's the best set of circumstances for our most fortunate citizens, for our billionaires, for our business owners, for our CEOs and employers. And personally, I'd say it's high time that we expand that discourse to include people who never own a business and never have employees, but also have lives that are worth living and expanding and protecting. And that I, for one, am happy to see a audacious policy proposal that is most focused on the people who, generally speaking, are left out of these conversations.
Yes, right. Imagine ending child poverty in one bill, you know? Imagine ameliorating the ongoing housing and environmental concerns of vast numbers of Americans through legislation. I mean, we used to do stuff like this. We don't do this anymore. So it's high time we got back to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did I answer your questions?
You did. You brought a lot of clarity to it. And you actually got me feeling, kind of pumped up. So congratulations on that.
Oh, good. Yeah. I'm pumped up too, and the timing of this is beautiful, Mark, because of the Rescue Act that just passed Congress. It kind of bolsters my own confidence that the Green New Deal or some elements thereof are actually possible in the foreseeable future.
Well, allow me to knock on wood. Let's make it so. Okay, so do you have a question for me for next time?
I do. And I know we piqued everybody's curiosity about cow belching. Earlier in this
we'll keep that one in our back pocket.
I'm going to spare you from researching that topic, Mark, okay? Instead, I want to ask you about a crisis that is brewing in America that really hasn't gotten enough attention in recent years. The digital media economy has devastated the newspaper industry, which used to be the primary source of local news. A study done in the fall of 2018 reported that 1,300 communities in the USA lost daily newspaper coverage since the year 2004 and are now called news deserts. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that number is even larger today thanks to the COVID recession. So my question for you is, what does the local journalism landscape look like? And what are the implications for our democracy of the loss of local newspapers?
Thank you for asking. Ironically, this is something, often your questions send me off in a direction that I hadn't gone before, but this is something that I've given a lot of thought to over the last few years.
Oh,
so I will be
fantastic.
I'll hit the ground running on this one. So if you have any thoughts on this episode, or if you would like to leave comments on previous episodes, we have a Facebook page. You can find it at Mansplaining Podcast. I hope you come by, like our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question, and we might answer it in a future episode. And if you'd like to do us a favor and help other people discover this podcast, leave us a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all we have for this episode, and thank you for coming by. We hope to see you again soon.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.